And here we are again.
Yes,
Yes.
we are.
Well, the last time we spoke, you told me about this philosopher at Harvard, Michael Sandel.
Yes.
And so I've been checking him out. And we were talking about ethics the last time.
Hmm.
And he has many things on the famous trolley car study.
Yes, he
And
does.
a lot of, I love his methods, the Socratic method. Um, but a lot of that is, is it better for one person to die in order to save five people? And then he runs through various scenarios.
Right.
You know,
But I think the important point that he was trying to make was, should ethical decisions be made through some sort of calculus, some sort of counting out the consequences of an act to determine its rightness, as opposed to thinking of an act as independent of such calculation? What is right, no matter how. Kant said, do good though the heavens fall. He clearly wasn't thinking about consequences in that statement. He felt that there was an inherent good in some things, some acts, and that was more important than any calculation. Sandel, in those variations on the trolley problem, was pretty much talking to the utilitarian view, which is the greatest good for the greatest number, or some variation of that.
but the thing that was interesting is, and Sandel in his writings even says, we can never be divorced from our roots, like our families and whatnot.
Right.
And so he seems to be very grounded, as does traditional philosophy, in the Judeo-Christian ethic,
Yes.
which obviously is a not a universal ethic. I mean, it's a very specific ethic, right?
Well, somewhat specific. There's a wide variety of ethical theories that would fall under the broad umbrella of Judeo-Christian foundations. Um, Clearly, he is not thinking of any Eastern philosophy and their ethical systems in this course. The course that you're referring to is his course on justice, and his focus in that course were essentially philosophers of the Western tradition, going back as far as the early Greeks and right up until the 20th century with John Rawls.
And this is where, kind of our topic today is ethics and AI, because AI obviously is not necessarily rooted in Judeo-Christian or any other ethics. It's just kind of, well, whatever. And even Sandel himself, is a practitioner of advanced technology, and he's been criticized by his colleagues in the academic world because he's reaching through, tens of millions of people through the technology, his video platforms and whatnot. And they're saying, oh, well, you're undermining our courses and our livelihood. And then he responded, well, I don't want to do that, but the genie's out of the box. The technology's there. So
Right. And the books were always there too. I mean, it's not just the technology. I mean, people always had, a professor would be hard put to argue that people shouldn't read philosophy books except in a philosophy class. These are ideas that are out there and have been out there for a few thousand years. And what Sandel is doing is, I think, bringing them to wider attention through the internet. But even in his class setting itself, having a student body of 300 students, in the audience, but
Well, I think there were like 1,100. I mean, it
well,
was,
it was quite a large
oh, it was
auditorium.
huge. Yeah. They said
And
his
but
courses were the most popular ever.
he did have the opportunity to give out to hand out microphones so that he could get feedback from the students and to engage them in discussions where they had to defend positions they were taking. At least the brighter ones of them were, and and so it isn't just I feel that this or that answer is the right answer. You had to give a reason for thinking that way, and then defend that reason against people who object to what you said. And I think this is the way philosophy should proceed. I mean, one of my favorite philosophers is a fellow named Henry Sidgwick, who is a British moral philosopher, economist, man of all trades, really, but whose book Methods of Ethics, I think, is one of the classic works in the field. But his approach was to take the strongest opposing argument and set it side by side with his own and see if he could defend against it. I think that is the intellectually honest way to proceed. I mean, it's easy when you don't give the other side a good chance. Then you just have a straw man to knock over, and that's easy. But it does in his class, in Sandel's class, by engaging the students and asking them to give the reasons for their positions, and attempting to overcome the objections to those reasons. I think he's making more than just a point in a philosophical class. He's teaching people how to think well, and that's good.
Yeah, no, actually, I was reading this book about the education of Queen Cleopatra of Egypt, and this is a brilliant educational method. I mean, not only would they have to have a firm knowledge of all of the facts in their world and mythology and literature and everything else, but then they were given a position and they would have to defend that position, and then they would have to defend the opposite position. Mm-hmm. So it really encouraged a tremendous flexibility of mind, all based on knowledge. I mean, wow.
Well, I think, what other choice is there? I mean, you can make stuff up, and that might get you some personal satisfaction, but it doesn't really get at the questions that are being raised. If we live in a real world and there are facts that we have to contend with, then a discussion that ignores the facts really doesn't get you very far, except by accident at best. So being thrust into the position where you have to recognize that yours is not the only view, that others have also thought about these issues, come up with different answers, and hopefully they are prepared to defend their method of coming up with their answers, and you can then weigh those two. And the difficulty is, in weighing opposite positions or different positions, do we agree upon the standard for weighing them? That's one of the tough questions. Do we have a common agreement on what will count as a good argument? And if we do, then in some cases, at least, you can reduce the disagreements to empirical questions. You go out and look at the world and see, does this work or not?
Well, let's pursue that. So how do you determine what the standard should be?
It's not, that is the $64,000 question. You're going to get different people objecting to any standard that is put forward. And if you are truly saying that the standard for weighing the validity of arguments and it's not just the logical validity of an argument. I mean, there's a mechanical way of saying whether an argument is valid or not in strict logic, but in the context of the world and facts and empirical data and so forth, Do we have a means for saying there is a single standard for doing this, and it is the only standard and everything else is wrong? I mean, if you were to claim that, if you were to claim science as a discipline, and I grant you that that is too broad a term to really be effective here, but let's suppose the scientific method was the way we decide questions of fact. If you can reduce moral questions to questions of fact, then the scientific method might come into play. And so, for example, I've always thought that the way to attempt to resolve differences in moral arguments is keep climbing the ladder until you find something that both parties agree to. We want a world where our children will have happy lives. You're going to find very few people who say, "No, I don't want that."
Right.
No, so that's, and we agree then. So the question.
All right, so you agree on that. So then, how do you work that down?
Well, then you have to ask, well, okay, what methods, what practical methods will achieve that end? And what do we mean by best achieve that end? Well, achieve that end with no or fewer negative consequences. It's not going to be a rosy road all the way to the end. There are going to be consequences that follow from any course of action. Let's give out money to every child and they'll be happy. Well, there are problems with that view, and that would work against it. But I mean, in more practical terms, people will raise questions of political philosophy. How should the government act in accordance with the value of making our children's lives better? Well, suppose we say health. Health will make their lives, if they're not healthy, they can't lead happy lives. Therefore, the government should provide universal health care for all children, free of charge. Free of charge at the point of administering the medical health. That's a position that some people take. Can we argue that? Well, other people will say, well, but that costs money and you're taking it from people without their agreement, and that's unfair, and therefore that system won't work. It won't make them happy because their parents will be impoverished after they're paying all these heavy taxes. And it goes on from there. So then you back off those arguments and see if there are others. It is the most difficult question, I think, in most philosophical arguments, particularly ethical arguments, and that is getting to agreement on the standard by which we judge the strength of the case, of the arguments people are making.
So my question is, I mean, we're entering this brave new world of artificial intelligence. And as you know, like the chatbot, which was only introduced in December of 2022, and we're only now in March of 2023, it has just taken off and revolutionized everything. I mean, it's frightening. And I just wonder if our ethical and philosophical constructs keep up with this technological revolution.
Well, have you read any of Isaac Asimov's stories?
I have, but I wasn't thinking of it in that context because I read them many years ago.
Yes, well,
before it was a threat.
They're old, but I mean, he wrote I, Robot, and he established certain laws of robotics, that robots couldn't harm people and so forth. And so, if you're looking at AI and asking, well, what limitations can be placed and how can we guarantee that they will? Well, we can't guarantee that they will because it's too big a world to do that. But if we had certain boundaries on what we would permit artificial intelligence to do.
Assuming we're intelligent enough to do it. I mean, yes. I'm sure you've read this New York Times columnist who somehow accessed the chat box inner life, and it was frightening. I mean, the thing was psychotic.
Yes. Well, who programs the chatbot? That's the question. And you're bordering on a question that has come up, in philosophy, that is, the nature of consciousness, and do we ever reach a level of complexity with a machine that we have created such that it takes on all the characteristics of a conscious being? The Turing test, I don't know if you're familiar with that. Alan Turing, who was early in computer technology, supposedly was instrumental in solving the Enigma code in World War II. He had a test. It was not a rigid test, but he said you were to imagine a screen so you couldn't see who you were talking to, and then engage in a conversation. And if you could not tell whether whatever it was on the other side of the screen was a human being or a machine, then the strong possibility exists that that machine would be conscious, would be able to communicate in the way that we do. And so, it occurred to me that the question about artificial intelligence and whether we're creating conscious beings by the complexity of capability that we're giving them could be put in reverse and say, has this shown that we human beings are essentially machines, that we are just very complex chemicals that are encased in our bodies, and that's how we work. Now, this is not an uncommon view. I mean, this view goes back centuries. Lametrie, a French philosopher, wrote a book called Man and Machine, and he was convinced that we were machines, that we are physical objects that work in accordance with the laws of cause and effect, and therefore consciousness doesn't really exist. It's a figment of our imagination, so to speak, and so everything is just mechanical. Even Descartes did not believe that animals had consciousness. He thought they were machines. Only humans, in a religious sense, had a soul. But you could argue that what the AI technology is showing us is how machine-like we really are, not the other way around, not the consciousness of the machine.
Interesting. Yeah, that's an interesting insight. And which brings us, to, a lot of people say that the next step in evolution is the singularity, the merger between the machine and the biological, and that we shouldn't be afraid of this. This is just the next step in evolution.
Yes.
But that presents a whole different level of ethical dilemmas.
It does. Well, I mean, we have been on that road in small ways, although not to the people involved. Artificial hearts, cochlear implants. There are a number of machines that have been implanted in human bodies to keep those bodies alive or functioning better. And we have not so far said, well, somehow this is creating a new entity, that this is a cyborg, this is a hybrid human / machine complex. It's when we get to...
But they're actually talking, as about implanting chips in the brain to enhance the brain. And so these will be like super human beings who indeed will be far superior to any biological human being, which would make all of our current debates about race and class and whatever rather quaint, because we'll have these like super technologically advanced things, And so what are the ethical dilemmas of that?
Well, first of all, I have my doubts as to whether that can actually occur. I mean, what we have been learning about the brain as a physical thing and as a means of activating the body has shown us that it is, at least to say the least, it is far more complex than we thought. I mean, things are going on there that are hard for us to grasp how they work. And the numbers are astounding. The number of synapses are, astronomical. And, to be able to get a machine in there somehow to interact with us raises all kinds of questions about the mind-body problem. A problem that some philosophers don't think really exists. Others think is an insoluble problem. And yet a third group are trying to figure out how they interact.
Can you elaborate on that? I don't quite understand.
Well, I mean, if you look at human beings as physical objects, consciousness is not a separate thing. It is simply what? A byproduct of it. This is where I find in philosophy, they call consciousness the hard problem, and I think that's an understatement. It is the hard problem. So the question is, traditionally has been posed as a mind-body issue. How does the mind interact with the body? Descartes, because they didn't know what the pineal gland did, they said that's the point where the brain and the mind meet and share. That's not true. But we haven't been able to figure out whether, in fact, there are two separate entities called mind and body, or whether the body is all there is, mind being something unidentifiable, really, in a physical world. But the question of whether a machine has consciousness will rest on this leap from just physical stuff to something beyond, to something with feelings, with memory, with emotions, with understanding nuance, all of the things that we think make us more than just a bundle of atoms. Could you duplicate that in a machine? And that's not clear.
Well, it's interesting. I read an article about a rabbi who delivered a sermon on a moral issue and then asked that several rabbinical scholars be cited. And then after he delivered it, and it was universally acclaimed as a very good sermon, he said, well, this was written by AI, but what AI cannot do is provide the human contact and the community. I was just reading, and as they say, it's just amazing how this thing has taken over.
Yeah.
The 20 most endangered jobs from AI. I mean, you can forget about being a university professor from now on because AI is just taken over.
Well, yeah, I know people say that. I have my doubts. I mean, I worry about it because if a generation of people begin to think that this is in fact a natural process, that we are naturally evolving to hand off to machines, to devices that we have put together, the functions that are normally performed by human beings now, the question will be, is it the same? Are we getting the same product? I had this question put to me when I was back in the Navy, when we were looking at distance learning. Would you get the same result from a class that you just took online or one in a live classroom? And I came to the conclusion that they would not be the same, that there was a social component to learning that was not producible by an online class. The interaction of student to student and the interaction of teacher to student was missing largely. If it was present at all, it was in a kind of stilted and narrow sense.
Well, elaborate on that. Why is that important?
Well, it appears that humans react favorably or can react favorably to other humans. And so when I was going around the country sitting in on in-person classes, inevitably there were tables of 8 students in the room. And at each of those tables, 2 of those people there didn't need the class. They already knew the subject better than the teacher. 2 of them were hopeless. They would never get this, no matter how long they were in the class. And the other 4 were in the middle somewhere. And they leaned on the ones who were better able, knew the subject in ways that were not available to them or that they felt comfortable with by talking to the professor, but to the teacher. And so that social contact gave them a better sense of receptivity, of understanding, of company, and that made a difference. And that would be lost, with a robot.
So maybe in some ways it may just come down to people learn in different ways, and so maybe many people will not be receptive to AI learning. They need the human contact.
Well, I suppose each of us, may have in our history, if we reflect back on our lives, that there was a teacher that we had who made all the difference for us, and who, when we think back to that teacher, we think it wasn't just the lecture that they gave us. It was the friendliness that they gave us. It was the encouragement that they gave us. That if you could produce a machine that did all that, well, fine. Maybe then we're talking about something. But if you can't, if it's simply, Deep Blue who's going to beat the other contestants on Jeopardy, well, that's a game. This is not the same as human interaction.
Interesting. Okay, good. This whole thing about the singularity, and it's not just machine, it's also, the bioethics. We can engineer our children. And I read a recent study where, would you want to genetically engineer your child to be smarter or whatever? So between machine enhancements and bioengineering, we're going to create tremendous quality in different differences between people. So we're going to have these enhanced people, and then we're going to have the other 7 billion of us who aren't enhanced, because I'm guessing this is going to be the really rich. So what are the ethical implications of that?
Well, it would be, it's similar to the distribution of wealth today. In some ways, there are people who, aside from their intelligence and wisdom or any other nice qualities they have a lot more money. And so there is a disparity there. If there's a disparity in intellect, there is a natural disparity in intellect. I don't think that's being cruel. It's a fact. Some people are just smarter than other people in certain ways. Intelligence is measured in a variety of ways, and some people have a natural intelligence that is not book learning. It's not that they can recite all the 50 state capitals. It's that they can put a bicycle together. That's intelligence. And there are a variety of other ways of
emotional intelligence.
There's emotional intelligence. Absolutely. Absolutely. And so, how you engineer somebody, would depend on what you thought was important to produce. But I mean, in a way, we have had this argument put forth, and it has been generally rejected. And now I'm talking about eugenics. The people who said we should breed only intelligent people, only all blonde, blue-eyed people, that kind of thing. Only the ones who are physically strong, and don't let the others breed at all, thus producing a race of humans of a certain character. That was posed in certain circles, but those circles have been denounced, and rightly so. And no one has seemed to come back and said, that wasn't a bad idea. Why don't we try that again? Except in the AI world.
So are you suggesting that technology should be suppressed? I mean, the technology's out there. I mean,
Well,
it's
you
like
can't. I
cloning.
don't
I
think
mean,
you can
we can
suppress.
clone these sheep. I mean, whether we should be doing this, I don't know, but we can do it.
Well, there are. I mean, I haven't followed this very closely, but I've read about conferences that have been held talking about this very issue. Should we limit the activity of people in producing or improving the technologies that would allow for gene splicing and gene manipulations, such that you increase the chance that the baby born will grow up to be very intelligent or very vigorous and strong and very compliant with orders, that trait, so that they'll do anything that they're told to do. And there are serious objections, and that's why often at these conferences they have a bioethicist there to talk about the risks that are involved there, because it's kind of like you remember in Fantasia, that cartoon of Walt Disney, where he had the sorcerer's apprentice, and the apprentice only knew some of the consequences of his act and not all of them, and then found out that the things he didn't know were terrible. And that's what I think people are worried about, and rightly so. That yes, it seems like a good idea at the time. Michael Crichton's novels seem to do a lot of this, where this seems like a good idea, we'll have a good result. But it did not. It had terrible results.
And of course, there's somebody out there is trying to bring back the woolly mammoth and the dodo and other things. I'm not entirely sure why we need these things, but the technology's out there and they can do it. So yeah, they want to do it.
Well, we live in a culture where, iPhone 17 will show up, and iPhone 17, if it hasn't already, will do things that no one really needs done, but it's because we can do them. We're fascinated by the fact that we can manipulate things in ways that nobody thought we could ever do, or even thought we should do. And that is what's dangerous. I think I think of it as a kind of childish view. These really smart guys who come out of MIT and schools like that, and they're really on top of everything. And they say, what we can do? We can do this. And they do it. And they never think about, well, what are the other consequences here? What will this also produce? Unemployment will occur at great rates because you have figured out how to do everything by machine, and you haven't figured out how to keep everyone else alive. The machines say, there is a story, I believe it's by Arthur C. Clarke, about Armageddon, where the devil's forces are massing and there's going to be the final battle between good and evil. And the human beings bring out all these robotic tanks and machines that will do battle with the devil. And so this battle begins and takes place, and the devil loses. And the human beings are overjoyed until they see all these robot tanks ascending into heaven. They won the battle. Not us. So those are consequences that they have.
That's funny. So is this the new frontier for philosophy?
Well, it's part of it. I mean, it's been a while since I've been on the front lines of philosophy, so I'm not sure exactly what the current journals are discussing. But it does seem to me to be a topic that has, both epistemological and moral consequences. Can you produce an object that will think and have emotions and have all the characteristics that we think of as human, and actually have them because they have been, because what consciousness is a function of the level of complexity of
So
the
how will we
device.
know if they're just simulating it or whether they're experiencing it?
Well, yeah, I worry about that. I worry about that. Some science fiction writers and movie makers have led people to believe in things that really don't make a lot of sense. It's kind of like Bitcoin. It doesn't make any sense. And, and suddenly everybody's jumping on the bandwagon. And it's really not, I would hope that it's not a serious question, that these things, yes, we can do certain things, but when I consider what, this 3 pounds of wet work up there can do, and do it for what, 80 or 90 years without taking a break, it's very hard for me to imagine duplicating that or having something produced that will equate to that function. That's quite a ways off and quite unnecessary, really. I don't think it's necessary. The only place I could think of where you might want something like that is in maybe a courtroom. Have a judge who is unemotional and just rational, but that has quite negative consequences, I believe, because that human sense of justice and mercy is missing. You haven't built that in yet, and we don't really know how that works, and so we wouldn't be able to make it so, and that would worry me. So I think it's an interesting subject to talk about, that people worry about them, and they probably should keep them in their minds. I don't think it's an imminent problem at this point. I think we are jumping to conclusions that this will.
Okay, well, interesting
quickly.
discussion, and we've got to wrap it up, but
Okay.
I look forward to talking to the next time.
I look forward to it myself.
Okay, bye.
Take care.